Sidney Poitier did nothing that night, but the next morning, the headline said he'd chosen a side.
It was October 1971, and Sidney Poitier was walking back to his hotel after a quiet dinner in downtown Philadelphia. He was in town for a film premiere, staying at the Bellevue, trying to keep a low profile. As he turned onto Walnut Street, he heard shouting ahead. A police officer had stopped a young black man against a storefront.
The scene was tense.
The young man's hands were raised. The officer's hand was on his weapon. A small crowd had gathered, watching from a cautious distance.
Sidney slowed his pace.
His instinct was to keep walking, to not get involved. But something made him stop. Maybe it was the fear in the young man's eyes. Maybe it was the way the crowd was frozen, afraid to intervene. Maybe it was the simple fact that Sidney Poitier had spent his entire career trying to show America that black men deserved dignity, and here was a moment where the dignity was in question.
He didn't rush forward. Didn't shout.
He simply stood there, visible, at the edge of the scene.
The officer glanced over, recognized Sidney immediately.
His entire demeanor shifted. The hand moved away from the weapon. The tone became more measured.
The situation de-escalated.
Within minutes, the young man was released with a warning.
No arrest. No violence.
The crowd dispersed.
Sidney continued to his hotel without speaking to anyone. He didn't give a statement. Didn't stop with the few people who'd recognized him. Just went to his room, assuming the incident was over. But here's what Sidney didn't know yet. Someone in that crowd had called a reporter. And by morning, the story had exploded. The headline in the Philadelphia Tribune read, "Sidney Poitier confronts police in tense standoff."
The article described him as intervening, challenging the officer, using his celebrity to prevent an arrest. None of which was accurate.
Sidney had simply stood there.
But the narrative was already being written, and it had nothing to do with what actually happened.
By noon, Sidney's phone was ringing constantly. His publicist. His lawyer. Studio executives. Civil rights organizations. Everyone wanted a statement. Everyone had an agenda.
The NAACP wanted him to speak at a rally about police brutality.
Student activists wanted him to publicly condemn the Philadelphia Police Department. The studio wanted him to issue a neutral statement that wouldn't alienate white audiences. The police union wanted him to clarify that he hadn't interfered with an officer's duties.
And Sidney, sitting in his hotel room, realized he'd become a symbol in a story he'd never agreed to be part of.
But wait, this is where everything actually started. Because Sidney made a decision that confused everyone.
He refused to make a statement.
Not because he didn't care. Not because he was afraid. But because he understood something most people didn't.
The moment he spoke, the story would no longer be about what happened.
It would be about Sidney Poitier's opinion.
And that young man, whose name was Marcus Webb, would disappear entirely from the narrative.
Sidney called his lawyer. "I need you to find out everything about what happened to Marcus Webb,
the young man from last night." His lawyer was confused.
"Sidney, everyone wants to know what you're going to say." "Forget what I'm going to say. Find out if Marcus is okay.
If he was charged with anything.
If he has legal representation. The lawyer paused. You want to help him privately?
Yes, Sidney said.
And I want it to stay private.
But the pressure was mounting. The civil rights organizations were holding press conferences, using Sidney's name, saying his presence had prevented another instance of police violence. They were calling him a hero, a protector, a symbol of resistance. The police union was pushing back, saying Sidney had interfered with legitimate police work, that his celebrity had prevented an officer from doing his job. They were calling him reckless, irresponsible, a vigilante. And the media was amplifying both narratives, turning a 30-second moment into a national debate about celebrity activism, police accountability, and racial justice. All while Sidney sat in his hotel room, saying nothing. His publicist was frantic.
Sidney, you have to respond.
The silence is being interpreted as either guilt or cowardice depending on who's talking.
Let them interpret it however they want, Sidney said calmly. But I'm not making a statement.
Why not? Because, Sidney said carefully, the moment I speak, this becomes about me.
My opinion. My stance. My political position.
And Marcus Webb, who is the actual person this happened to, becomes a footnote.
He paused. I'm not going to let that happen. But people are using your name anyway. They're speaking for you.
Let them, Sidney said.
But I'm not going to add my voice to the noise.
His lawyer called back that evening with information.
Marcus Webb was a 19-year-old student at Temple University.
He'd been stopped because he matched the description of a robbery suspect, which he didn't actually match beyond being a young black man in the area. He hadn't been charged with anything. He was shaken but physically okay.
And he had no idea Sidney Poitier had been there. Sidney absorbed that. Then he asked, "Does he have a lawyer?"
No, his lawyer said.
He can't afford one. Even though he wasn't charged? He's worried they might come back. Wants to be prepared but doesn't have the resources.
Get him a lawyer, Sidney said.
A good one. Send me the bill. Don't tell him it's from me.
His lawyer hesitated.
Sidney, if you're going to help him, why not do it publicly? Make it part of your statement. Show that you're taking action. Because, Sidney said, that would make it about my generosity. I don't want credit for doing what's right. Just make sure he's protected. The lawyer did as Sidney asked.
Marcus Webb received a call from a prominent civil rights attorney offering pro bono representation.
Marcus was confused but grateful. He never learned Sidney's role.
Meanwhile, the media storm continued. Student groups organized protests, carrying signs with Sidney's image, demanding he speak out. Conservative commentators criticized him for his silence, saying it proved he didn't actually care about the issues.
Liberal activists criticized him for not using his platform more actively. Don't miss this. Because everyone thought they knew what Sidney's silence meant. But nobody asked him.
A week later, Sidney was subpoenaed. The police union had filed a formal complaint alleging interference with police duties, and Sidney was called to give testimony about what happened that night. He arrived at the municipal building with his lawyer, walking through a crowd of protesters on both sides.
Some supporting him, some opposing him. All of them loud.
Inside, in the hearing room, Sidney was sworn in.
The police union's attorney stood up.
Mr. Poitier, can you describe in your own words what happened on the night of October 14th?
Sidney spoke clearly and calmly.
I was walking to my hotel. I saw a police officer speaking with a young man. I stopped on the sidewalk approximately 15 feet away.
I observed the interaction.
When it concluded, I continued to my hotel.
That's all?
The attorney asked, skeptical. That's all, Sidney confirmed.
You didn't speak to the officer?
No.
You didn't speak to the young man?
No.
You didn't interfere in any way?
I stood on a public sidewalk and observed a police interaction.
That is my right as a citizen.
The attorney changed tactics.
But your presence affected the outcome, didn't it?
The officer's behavior changed when he recognized you. I can't speak to the officer's internal state, Sidney said.
I can only describe my actions,
which were to stand and observe. The attorney pressed harder.
Mr. Poitier, do you believe your celebrity status gave you special power in that situation? Power that an ordinary citizen wouldn't have? Sidney was quiet for a moment.
Then he said something that changed the entire hearing. I believe, Sidney said carefully, that the question you should be asking is why a police officer's behavior would change simply because someone is watching.
If an officer conducts himself differently when observed, that suggests the unobserved conduct is the problem, not the observation. The room went absolutely silent. The attorney didn't have a response.
The hearing officer, a city magistrate named Thomas Brennan, leaned forward. Mr. Poitier, he said, the city has been waiting for you to make a public statement about this incident.
Why have you remained silent? Sidney looked at him directly. Because, Sidney said, I am not the story. Marcus Webb is the story.
The fact that a young man can be stopped, detained, and frightened for the crime of matching a vague description, that's the story. The fact that people are more interested in my opinion than in his experience, that's the problem. I refuse to contribute to that problem by centering myself in a narrative that isn't about me.
Judge Brennan sat back. So you're saying your silence was intentional? Absolutely, Sidney said. I was offered dozens of platforms to speak. Press conferences, rallies, interviews.
Every single one of them wanted to use my name, my face, my words to advance their agenda.
The civil rights organizations wanted me to be a hero. The police union wanted me to be a villain. The media wanted me to be controversial.
But none of them, not one, asked what Marcus Webb needed.
What he experienced. What would actually help him.
So I chose not to participate in a system that was using a young man's trauma as a political football.
The hearing ended shortly after. No charges were filed. Sidney had broken no laws. But more importantly, something shifted.
The media coverage changed.
Reporters started actually interviewing Marcus Webb, asking about his experience, his fears, his perspective.
Civil rights organizations redirected their focus from Sidney's celebrity to Marcus's case and hundreds of similar cases. The police department, under scrutiny, implemented new guidelines for stop and frisk procedures. And Sidney Poitier, who'd been called everything from a hero to a coward for his silence, quietly returned to his life. But the impact of his choice, his refusal to be the story, rippled forward. Years later, in 1998, Sidney was interviewed about his career. The interviewer mentioned the Philadelphia incident. "You were criticized pretty heavily for staying silent," the interviewer said. "Do you regret that choice?" Sidney shook his head. "I regret that Marcus Webb was stopped in the first place. I regret that a 19-year-old student had to feel afraid of the people who are supposed to protect him. But I don't regret refusing to make myself the center of his story." The interviewer pressed. "But couldn't you have used your platform to bring more attention to the issue?" Sidney smiled slightly. "I did use my platform. I used it to redirect attention away from me and toward the actual issue. That's harder than it sounds. Because everyone wanted me to perform. To give them a soundbite, a stance, a moment they could clip and share and debate. But that performance would have obscured the real problem. So I refused to perform." That interview was watched by a young activist named James Chen, who was struggling with his own relationship to media attention. He'd been asked to speak at rallies, give interviews, become the face of a movement. And he felt increasingly uncomfortable with it. Watching Sidney talk about redirecting attention, about refusing to perform, gave James language for what he'd been feeling. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do with a platform is not use it. James went on to become a behind-the-scenes organizer, someone who worked to amplify marginalized voices rather than centering his own. And when asked about his approach, he always referenced Sidney's choice in Philadelphia. Here's what Sidney Poitier understood that night, and what everyone with any kind of platform needs to learn. Not every moment requires your voice. Not every situation needs your opinion. Not every story should center you, even when people are demanding that it does. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is step back, stay quiet, and redirect attention to the people who are actually affected. To the people whose stories matter more than your commentary on their stories. Sidney could have given a powerful speech about police brutality. Could have used the moment to advance important causes. Could have satisfied everyone who wanted him to perform activism. But he understood something crucial. Marcus Webb didn't need Sidney's speech. He needed a lawyer. He needed protection. He needed people to actually listen to his experience rather than using it as a vehicle for celebrity commentary. So Sidney provided those things quietly, without credit, without performance. And in doing so, he modeled a different kind of activism. The kind that doesn't center the helper but the helped. The kind that doesn't perform for applause but works for actual change. The kind that understands that sometimes silence is more powerful than speech when the speech would drown out the voices that actually need to be heard. When Sidney Poitier died in 2022, Marcus Webb, now a 50-year-old civil rights attorney himself, wrote an obituary that most people didn't see. In it, he talked about that night in Philadelphia. About how terrified he'd been. About how the presence of a stranger had somehow changed everything. About how he'd later learned that stranger was Sidney Poitier. and about how, years later, he'd discovered that Sidney had quietly paid for his legal representation, had quietly ensured he was protected, had quietly refused to make himself the hero of Marcus's story.
Webb wrote, Sidney Poitier taught me that power isn't about being seen. It's about seeing clearly what's needed and providing it without demanding recognition.
He could have used me to build his legend.
Instead, he used his legend to protect me. That's the difference between performance and principle. And it's a lesson I've carried through my entire career. That's the legacy. Not the silence itself, but what the silence protected. The space it created. The attention it redirected. The principle it upheld.
So here's the lesson, and it matters more than ever in an age where everyone's expected to have an opinion on everything, to perform their politics publicly, to turn every moment into content.
Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. Not because you don't care, but because your something would get in the way of what actually matters.
Sometimes your voice, your opinion, your platform would drown out the voices that actually need to be heard. And refusing to add to that noise, choosing strategic silence over performative speech, that's not weakness.
That's wisdom. Sidney Poitier knew when to speak and when to step back.
He knew when his voice would help and when it would harm. He knew that not every moment required his participation, and that sometimes his greatest contribution was his absence from the narrative.
Learn that. Practice it.
And the next time you're pressured to speak, to take a stance, to make yourself part of a story that isn't yours, ask yourself Sidney's question.
Will my voice help the people actually affected? Or will it just center me?
If the answer is the latter, have the courage to stay silent. To work behind the scenes.
To redirect attention where it belongs. That's real power. That's real principle.
That's how you honor the people whose stories deserve to be heard without your commentary drowning them out.
Sidney Poitier did nothing that night.
And because he did nothing publicly, he was able to do everything that actually mattered privately.
Remember that. And choose accordingly.